Hi, welcome to the Bible Standard, where you are guaranteed in-depth Bible study and analysis. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and drop a comment in the comments area to have your say, and we'll do our best to reply.
We're going to look first of all at some of the scriptural passages that relate to Ephesus, and then we're going to go through a series of slides to get a bit of a feel for what is sitting in the ruins of Ephesus today. Now, I'm assuming that living here, and therefore that much closer to that area of Asia Minor, that a number of you will have been to Ephesus. Can I have a show of hands for anyone that's been there? We have a few. Okay, not that many. I'm quite relieved to hear that, actually. So you may see something which is familiar to you. I'm really happy as we go through for people to ask questions or contribute other things that they know of about the city of Ephesus. But what is extraordinary about Ephesus is the way in which the ruins have been preserved. So it's possible to go there and actually get quite a good feel for what the city was like that the Apostle Paul visited, and that we had brothers and sisters in an ecclesia in as well. And therefore, it's actually quite moving to get a feel for what life was like when Paul moved into that city. It was an extremely sophisticated place. And he preached the truth and established an ecclesia there. And there's a number of people in Scripture who are linked with the city of Ephesus. And it's quite moving to think of our brethren there. And one of the things that really struck me was, if the Apostle Paul could walk into a city like that alone, with a very small group with him, and actually preach and establish ecclesias there, then we can preach and have people respond in any city, because it was such an extraordinary city. Good. Let's just, before we start looking at some of the pictures, let's have a quick look at Acts, the chapter that's just been read for us, Acts 18. We have the tail end of the Apostle's second missionary journey. He tarries in verse 18 for a good while in Corinth, and when he takes his leave of the brethren from Corinth, two very important people travel with him. And it says there that he had with him Priscilla and Aquila. And verse 19, he came to Ephesus and left them there. He entered into a synagogue, he reasoned with the Jews, they wanted him to tarry longer, he said, no, I'm heading back to Jerusalem, and off he went. That was the end of his second missionary journey, and he left Aquila and Priscilla behind to work with the fledgling group that had started to respond. Then in verse 22, as his second journey ends, it says he lands at Caesarea, he goes down to Antioch, and after he had spent some time there, he departed. That's the beginning of the third missionary journey. He goes over all the country of Galatia and Phrygia in order, strengthening all the disciples. We then have a few verses that speak about Apollos. So the conversion of Apollos was one of the significant steps that took place, because he then became a force for good in preaching the truth himself, a marvelous orator, eloquent man, and mighty in the Scriptures. And Aquila and Priscilla had a key role in that. When we get to chapter 19, we've now got Paul on his third missionary journey. And it says that while Apollos was at Corinth, Paul, having passed through the upper coasts, came to Ephesus. And here he made a base which he operated from for 3 years. We know that because in Acts chapter 20, when he called the elders of Ephesus to walk and meet him, and he met them on the beach, he explained to them that he'd spent 3 years teaching them and also warning them of the sorts of things that were going to take place. So the apostle used the city of Ephesus as his base. Now, it would appear that he made side journeys into different places. So, for example, it's most likely that First Timothy was written, the first letter to Timothy was written during that 3-year period when the apostle had moved into a side journey to Macedonia and wrote back. He left Timothy behind there, and he wrote to Timothy, giving him encouragement on how to conduct himself in ecclesial life in Ephesus. He was then back in Ephesus. We've got some more dramatic events that take place. Again, conversion of people who knew only the baptism of John. 7 sons of Sceva, the Jew who tried to cash in on the growing power and influence of the truth. 2 years that he spent in the school of Tyrannus. We pick that up in verse 9 and verse 10 of chapter 19. Then, as we get towards the end of that period, in verse 21, Paul purposed, when he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, to go to Jerusalem. So Paul's now heading away from the city of Ephesus. But before he goes, we have the riot that takes place in the city of Ephesus. Demetrius the silversmith, who saw himself losing much of his gain from the silverware that he had constructed. It's an interesting little statement there, actually. It says Demetrius in verse 24, a silversmith. Verse 25, called together the workmen of like occupation. And one of the suggestions that's been made is that he was the head of the guild of the silversmiths. The heads of the guilds were extremely powerful and influential people. And he also had influence over some of the other trades and craftsmen that were involved in that process. I wonder, this is a complete sidetrack and an aside, but I wonder if there was any association with a certain Alexander, a coppersmith, through that process. I don't know, entire speculation, but it's interesting to see the power and influence that some of these men had. And we will look at the location where that riot took place and some of the events that happened there. In chapter 20, the disciples bade farewell and Paul left the city at that time. And we know that he was never to go back, because later he told the elders at Ephesus that he would not go and return to the city and see their face again. But of course, that's not the end of the role of Ephesus in the Ecclesia, in the Scriptures, because we've got not just the first letter to Timothy, but also the second. It would appear that Timothy spent quite a lot of time in the area of Ephesus, working with that ecclesia, but also that he too made side trips to different places. We read of him in other places, but that he went back to Ephesus again later. We have of course, the epistle to the Ephesians, and then we have the letter to Ephesus in Revelation chapter 2. So when you look at that, you think, actually, this is quite a significant place. And probably it was the most significant of all of the Asian ecclesias, and it was used as the central base from which the truth spread out and people supported it, travelling to and from Ephesus. So as we look at Ephesus, we basically have a really simple objective tonight, and that's just to get a little bit of a feel for the city that our brethren were operating in. Think of people, for example, like Onesiphorus, and it would appear from Paul's comments that Onesiphorus lost his life doing something to support the Apostle Paul. So his household that Paul speaks about were in Ephesus. Trophimus, an Ephesian, turned up with Paul later in the city of Jerusalem. Tychicus. There's all sorts of these names that we come across in Scripture are closely associated with the city of Ephesus. So clearly our earlier brothers and sisters found that was quite a central base. Okay, let's go from there, and I'm going to spend a bit of time now just getting a little bit of an overview for Ephesus itself and where it was based, and then we're just going to track physically through the city as well. Okay, so I'm not sure if you can actually see that red dot at all. It's pretty small. No, you can't. Okay. Some people can. Okay. What we'll do is the people at the front can enthusiastically say yes, and we'll pretend everybody else can as well. Okay. So the area of Ephesus is sitting in around here. There's a little island. This Christadelphian is the city now. Actually, I'm just going to go. It's actually just up sitting in this area here. And Ephesus was one of the major ports of Asia at the time. So let's just zoom in a little bit more into that. So Christadelphian is sitting down this area here. I can't actually see that very well myself on the screen. Sorry, try again. Christadelphian is there. Ephesus itself is sitting in about here. Quite extraordinary, the topographical changes that have taken place since then. So Christadelphian is this little area here. If anyone's been on a cruise, that's called in, and they've done a day's side trip into Ephesus. That's how a lot of people tend to see Ephesus. The boats come in at Christadelphians, which is this area here, and you get transported into Ephesus. Okay, so that's that little blip. That's Christadelphians there. And I don't know if you can actually see the port of Ephesus in there, but it's quite distinctive. And once you've seen it, you'll always be able to spot it from a satellite map. Let me show you why. Do you see that round circle there with a long tail? You can see that there? That's the port of Ephesus, and that long tail is the channel which they dredged as the port was silting up. Now, I think it'd be very hard to sail a ship into Ephesus today. It's literally kilometres from the coast. But that was the original coastline. That's the port of Ephesus, and the city of Ephesus lies to the right of it, sitting up in there. So that little area, as you look down on it now, you can actually see it a little more. There's the port of Ephesus, and there's that the channel which they dredged, a bit like the Suez Canal, as they claim. Maybe not quite so significant. Okay, if we're looking down on the city of Ephesus now, the port is this area here, and the channel would head up into the ceiling. So this is what's above on the hill above the port. So we came in at the top, and then you track down through the city. There's the theatre, the Greek-Roman theatre, and there was the road down to the port as well. The city was structured in 3 sections. Hippodamus was the Greek planner who laid out the theoretical model for all Greek cities, and most of them conformed to it more or less. There was a lower city where the common people lived. There was a central city which was sort of more administration, and then the upper city was where the rulership sat and where many of the temples were. So that was the aristocracy and the ruling of the common people. And so as you look at the Greek cities, you get that sort of a rough structure. And sometimes you see it on a mountain, and you see the Acropolis at the top of a mountain. And so Hippodamus came up with this theoretical model for a Greek city, and a lot of them conform to it. So as we come in the top here, what we'll see is that the Senate and the ruling areas were up the top here. You go down through the temple areas. There's a couple of very significant streets down here, which we will talk about, and some famous buildings. The Agora, which was that area there, which was probably, I mean, it's an assumption, but probably where the scrolls were burnt. And there's the theatre that Gaius and Aristarchus were taken into. So that just gives you a little bit of a flow, and we will basically start up here and walk down through these areas and down these couple of streets and along there as we go along. Does anybody have any comments or questions, other things they want to add from their visits or readings? No? Okay. Good. That's just zooming in a little on it. So we come in at the top. This area here, it's known as the Odeon. That's actually, again, one of those semicircular theatres. That's where the Senate sat. The Senate, or the bull, it's sometimes called the Bulletarian, and that's where the Senate met. That had seating for 1,600 people. So if they had a gathering of the upper echelons of the city, they could bring them in there. Sometimes it was also used for plays and as a theatre, hence the name Odeon, as opposed to Bulletarian, which is where the Senate or the bull would sit. Excuse these names, but you've got the Bulletarian, which is where the Senate operated, and next door to the Bulletarian you had the town hall or the Prytaneum. And in Greek cities, they were almost always side by side. So you'd find the town hall, and you'd find where the Senate would sit, the Bulletarian, normally side by side in a Greek city. So you actually start to get an impression that there's a lot of structure and a lot of formality to the administrative structures of some of these cities. The city, it was essentially a Greek city. When Troy was sacked and fell, it opened up Asia to the Greeks. And so they moved across the Sea of Marmara and across the Bosphorus, and their influence extended. Androclos was supposedly the founder of the city of Ephesus, He was the son of the Athenian king at the time. They have this glorious myth that he was told by one of the priests that wherever he saw a boar and a fish together, he would build a city, and he was eating some fish and happened to see a wild pig, and so that was it. But as the guide said, actually, probably it was a really good location for a city. And that's why they built Ephesus in that area. So it was a Greek city. Obviously, the Persians controlled it for about 200 years until a certain gentleman by the name of Alexander the Great came along, and the city ended up being under Greek control again. The city was actually devastated around that time by a massive earthquake, and Alexander offered to help rebuild it, and they turned him down. He also offered to help rebuild, actually, particularly the Temple of Diana. And they turned him down, saying, and they were very politic about it, they said it would be inappropriate for one god, i.e. you, to make a gift to another. And so they turned his funding down because they wanted to stay independent of Alexander himself. And so they did a lot of rebuilding themselves. Rome, there was another earthquake that Rome helped them rebuild from under Tiberius, which they did accept. It became it became the most dominant city in Asia. That's why it was such a good base to use. There were 3 good ports: the port of Smyrna, Pergamon, and Ephesus were the 3 good ports in Asia. To begin with, Pergamon was more prominent. After Alexander died, you know how his empire was divided up amongst his 4 generals? Well, Antigonus ended up controlling that area. And Lysimachus ended up with Thrace, which is northern Greece into Bulgaria that we'd think of today. They went to war. Lysimachus was successful, so he ended up controlling the area that included the city of Ephesus. He renamed it after his wife, Arsinoe, for a period of time, but after he died, it reverted back to Ephesus again. And from then it started to grow. Lysimachus, actually, he made a mistake. He gathered a lot of money. They claim 9,000 talents of silver from his various campaigns. And he sent it back to Pergamon, where his deputy by the name of Terrace was ruling on his behalf, and he entrusted the money to this employee, servant, Terrace, who then promptly absconded with the money, or took it off him, joined forces with the Seleucids, fought him in a battle, and Lysimachus was killed. And so Terrace founded the Pergamon dynasty in Pergamon, until Attalus III came along, who was one of the descendants, and he bequeathed it to Rome on his deathbed. It's interesting, as you listen to the guides talking about it, some people claim that he was a madman, and what an idiot to give away his empire to Rome. Others say he was extremely smart because he could see the way in which the influence of Rome was coming over from the west, and so rather than getting conquered, he invited them in. Well, as part of that, they inherited Ephesus. And then it started to grow as a commercial centre for Asia, and it became a Greco-Roman city, and it became the 3rd largest city in the Roman world. So huge, actually, after Rome and Alexandria. So that just gives you a little bit of a feel for how it developed and why it became such a powerful and prosperous base as well. Okay. As you go down from the upper area, you go down a street which is called Curates Street. We'll show some pictures. This area here is a very interesting set of apartments that they've been excavating, down to a library here, past the Agora, and on to, there's the Agora, the marketplace, onto this area here, which is the theatre itself. Now, some of the buildings, some of the magnificent ruins you see were actually after the time of the Apostle Paul. Some of them the period of Domitian, Trajan, even Hadrian. And so some of the things you will see actually were after the date of the Apostle Paul, but certainly while there was still an ecclesia in that area. Okay, that's looking from the sea. You can see the port there. That's looking up. So there's the port road, there's the theatre. It's looking back up the other way and up the city to where we come in at the top. Okay, and that's what it looked like in the Apostles' day. Quite an extraordinary metropolis, quite extraordinary. We'll have a few minutes at the end. We've got a little bit of an animated, it's a model that's been developed, an animation of walking through the streets. It was mind-boggling, truly mind-boggling. So there's the theatre sitting there. There's the Agora there, with buildings around the outside, and there's Curates Street, which runs up in that direction up there. Okay, so this is starting up at the top, and we're going to be walking down. So as you walk in, that's what you see. If you look across to the right, there's the Odeon, or the Boulaterian, which was that theatre that seated 1,600 people. It was all marble. It was roofed over. The archaeologists have done a little bit of a reconstruction of it, which is why it looks a little bit like it did originally. And then past there is the Praetorium as well. So that's a little bit closer to it. You can see there's the Boulaterian, or the Senate House is sitting there. And just over that little rise is where the Praetorian was. And that's through to the Praetorian, or the Senate House. Okay, as you walk along, you find this sort of thing sitting along here. That's a few of them stored up. Clay pipes. Have you seen clay sewer pipes around the streets here? Well, they have a very ancient origin. They had an extraordinary water system to feed or to provide drinking water for 250,000 residents. They had 3 major aqueducts which came in. One of them was reasonably short, one was 7 kilometres long, the other was more than 30 kilometres long. Water was expensive, so you paid according to the size of your pipe that came into your house. And small pipes were more expensive than large pipes because your water pressure was that much better. So they had quite a sophisticated system of water reticulation through the city as a whole. Okay, there's the Praetorian, or the town hall. And there's not a lot left of it. The Boulaterian was sitting up to the right. They were always side by side. Okay, there is the Boulaterian, or the Odeon. Now this here is also an Agora, but it's the civic Agora. So it's not the main market, which was down the bottom and larger. This was the centre of the civil infrastructure and management of the city as a whole. There's not a lot remaining of that now. It's just basically a flat area. We are across here, we're walking across the top of that, and if you come to that point there, there's a bank. So we're actually going to go and do that now, and you can look down on the next layer of the city below. And that's what you see. So as you look down, this was, and I'll show you some pictures shortly, a temple of Domitian, who was probably the emperor at the time when the Apostle Paul was exiled to Patmos. And the street that runs down here, through some central gates and down into Curates Street, which then keeps running down the hill. Okay, so that's what's left of Domitian's temple. In actual fact, the arches there, the Romans brought quite an interesting architectural feature, which was the use of arches. Whereas the Greeks tended to use flat lintels, the Romans brought in the arches, and they used those. They were effectively a retaining for a big platform above it, and the temple then sat on top of that. And that's what his temple looked like. If you just go back one, you can see those steps. There's some steps just going up there. That's overlaid over the top of those steps now. So you can see that there was multiple stories, and it was on the top. Now, Domitian they talk about him being as being a crazy man. He was the brother of Titus, so Vespasian, then Titus. When Titus died, Domitian took over, and he tried to make the Roman Empire worship him as a living god. So they had the emperor cults, and basically what would happen is when an emperor died, it was the accepted thing that you then worshipped him as a god. And they did that to try and establish their credibility. Well, he was power hungry, so he tried to force people to worship him as a god while he was alive. And the populace hated that. He defied the Senate. He was assassinated. And when he was assassinated, they then had this process which they called, and I might not have the phrase quite right, it's damnatio memoriae, something like that, which is basically blotting out their memory. And that was done to Domitian. So they carved their names off buildings, they removed their heads off statues, they blot out their faces in paintings, and they destroy documents that record much about them. And it happened at a number of times in history, and that's what the Roman Empire, basically what they did to Domitian after he was gone. Renamed it actually, I think, in honour of this particular area, in honour of Vespasian. Okay, now what we're doing is we've turned around and we're going back uphill, and we'll go along and down the street here. Okay, so we're now going to be following down the hill there, and that's what we're doing there. Now, those marble paving stones that we're walking on there are the original paving stones back to the Apostles' time. So it's quite remarkable to be walking down on the streets that our brethren would have been walking on. As you go further down, it then drops into Curates Street, but it is quite remarkable to think, yes, these are the original flagstones. They are very dangerous to walk on, because they're extremely slippery. And they have signs everywhere, and they have ambulances at the bottom of the city, and they cart people away every day. And we watched people slipping over. It's been worn smooth over the centuries. See those grooves cut there? Those are original, that's not recent. So they actually had those cut as a occupational safety and health, we call it in New Zealand, OSH. But they cut those grooves in to stop people slipping over in those days. They are still extremely slippery, polished marble. Okay, so as you look further down, that street runs down here and then goes past the Memmius Monument here. The Memmius Monument was actually built in honour of Sulla Felix, who was a Roman, I think he was a general, but basically after the king of Pontus had come and sacked the city, there were 80,000 Romans put to death. Many of them were in the city here. And he came and freed the city. He was an extremely popular man. He went back to Rome and they actually appointed him as a dictator. Now, we think of a dictator as being someone like the gentleman that currently runs North Korea. But in those days, they would actually vote and appoint someone as a dictator. And it was an appointment for 2 years. And they gave them almost unlimited power. So it's a bit like, I don't know if you have in this country what we have at home, the declaration of martial law, when basically they take over all rights and privileges and rule the country with almost complete powers. Well, that's what a dictator had. And he did that for 2 years. He reduced the power of the tribunes, increased the power of the senates, and then retired. He was a very popular man, quite unlike many politicians today. We won't look at it in much detail, but that's his monument. There's a series of friezes that were there, which are in the Ephesus Museum today. Then you come down, this is looking back up the hill actually, but you come down the street and you go through this area which is called the Gates of Hercules, or the Pillars of Hercules. So as you crossed up into that top area of the city, you go through these two pillars. And as was pointed out to us, about 5% of the population could read, about 2% of the population could read and write. So they use things like this as a communication method to give messages to the populace as a whole. So as you come through those gates into the upper city and you go past Hercules, who was given the 12 tasks, one of them was to slay a lion. Often he's dressed in a lion's skin. And the message that's going through is, be careful as you come through here. This is the realm of the rulers and the gods. They are extremely powerful. And there was subliminal messaging that was being conveyed. It was a very effective form of population control. And so that there was purpose behind a lot of the imagery that was used in these carvings as well. And then below there you drop down into Curates Street. Now, Curates Street was shopping. So on either side, you've got the major thoroughfare and you've got the shops on either side. So that mosaic floor, those are the areas of the shops. Let me see if that's working. Yes. So this area, so the street runs down there, and these are the shops. Where they opened out onto the front, they were shops. Where they opened onto side streets, they tended to be more warehousing. And they were multi-storey buildings, so you've got apartments on the second and third floor above the shops below. Okay, so that's just walking down. You can see the pillars. Okay, and that's what it looked like in those days. So quite spectacular. Notice something there about the, I'm going to call them idols, the statues. You notice they're painted. So if you go to the Vatican and you walk through and you see all the Greek statues which they have there, everything's white marble. But when they were originally done, they were painted. The eyes were painted blue. They had flesh colours on their faces. They were designed to be very imposing and to look like people, not like something cleverly carved in stone, but to be very lifelike and realistic. So that's what the street looked like in the days when the Apostle Paul, Timothy, Priscilla and Aquila, etc., were walking in those streets. The goddess Nike, goddess of victory, the fountain of Trajan. Now, of course, Trajan was after the times of the Apostle Paul. I'm just trying to remember. I think, I could be wrong here, someone might be able to correct me, but I think he may have been immediately after Domitian, but not long after anyway, and he was before Hadrian. So that gives you a bit of a time period feel for it. And if you have a closer look, you can actually see his name carved there. It was an extremely imposing edifice. Water was piped in, there were huge pools, a massive pond inside, which went to a fountain outside for the populace to be able to drink from. Either side as you're going down are all these streets which just go up the hill, and the houses literally went all the way up the hill here. They reckon, I've seen estimates between 5 and 15% of the city has been excavated. Most of it's beneath orange, peach and olive groves. So much of the area has yet to be excavated properly. But those terraced streets went up the hill, and all the houses were terraced up there, and there's just lots of them as you go down. Okay, as you come further down, there's a little bit of a vantage point there. We're going to go and have a look inside this area here, and we're going to look briefly at the Celsus Library, which was built about, it was finished, about 135 AD, so quite some time after the life of the Apostle Paul. As you look down on some of these areas here, it's quite extraordinary to see just how sophisticated life was. So that's that big white covered building. These are various apartments that show you what living in the city of Ephesus was like, particularly for the wealthy. And that's a bit of an artist's reconstruction. So you can see, particularly for the wealthy, it was a very sophisticated city as a whole. That frieze is actually, they're not sure whether it was around a door lintel or whether it was on some furniture, but that's ivory. And I'm going to see if I can. Yes, I can. Just look at the detail on the carving of those faces up to the right. I mean, it's an extraordinary piece of work. That's in the Ephesus Museum at the moment. The Temple of Hadrian, which again was a bit later. Again, some of those side streets gives you a little bit of a feel for it. Right, does anybody know what that is? Toilet. That was an extremely important social centre. It was all marble. This is for men. It was all marble. And you would send your slave down first to sit on the seat and warm it up for you before you came. There's running water under here, taking away the waste, and there's water running in front of you here, which they would use with a sponge and vinegar. And this was a place where you came and chatted. So, of course, the poor people didn't have these sorts of facilities. They just used a clay jar. All the liquid waste was recycled for tanning and, believe it or not, for washing. So their hygiene rules were slightly different from ours today. You can't see it very well there, but that's the same area. But there are some areas where you can actually, and some of the houses are like this too, there are small stone foundations or little piles, and there was a suspended stone floor. This is for the very wealthy, and they had water that was heated running under those floors to actually give central heating under the stone floors. So the level of sophistication amongst the wealthy there was really quite something. When you get into some of the houses further down, plaster walls, it was a fresco style art. You would plaster the wall and then paint it while it was still wet. But you could change, you know how you might change the decor in your living room now? Well, they could do the same. So what they would do is they would actually chisel those holes in there so that the next layer of plaster could protrude into those holes and actually would stay on the wall. And you could redecorate your house, and that's what those little holes are for. You'll also see these larger holes here. The top ones were actually for floor beams. Some of the lower holes were for ventilation, for air movement through the house, but these were multi-storey buildings. That's the Temple of Celsus. Not so much interest to us from a biblical point of view. It was the third largest library in the world after Alexandria and Pergamon. Pergamon was very interesting because that's where they developed the parchment, the concept of the writing on leather, parchment skins, and that's where the name parchments come from, Pergamon. And I'm not sure if this is just sort of a myth which the guide liked to share with us or not, but there was a lot of conflict between Alexandria and Pergamon in terms of who was going to have the preeminence from a library perspective. And so the Alexandrian library put a block on sending papyrus to Pergamon for their library, and that encouraged the development of the parchment system. So they claim. Okay, that's what it looked like. Celsus, he was one of the first Greeks to become a Roman consul. He was born up in, I think, Sardis. He was born and brought up in Sardis, but he became a consul appointed by Rome over this city, and then later proconsul over actually the whole area of Asia. So extremely popular. To keep his name going, he provided the funds, and his son, who also became a consul, then built this in his honour. This makes it interesting for us. Can you see what that is on one of the steps? It's a menorah, a little bit of graffiti, but what it suggests is there was a Jewish influence sitting in the city in those days. Okay, when you go out of that, you go through, there's a couple of very large and imposing gates which were funded by Hadrian. You go through into the Agora. So this is the marketplace, 22 shops on each side. It's largely square, so 88 shops around the outside, colonnaded under roofs and a big open area in the middle. That's where the meat market was, the fish market, the slave market. It's probably where the Apostle Paul practiced his trade as a tent maker, because a lot of the trades operated in that region as well. Interesting comment that was made to us actually was that as a tent maker, you can take your tools of trade with you quite easily. And also, tent makers worked on sails. So it was quite a good way to get passage on ships. And I just thought that's quite an interesting perspective actually on how the apostle was able to travel by ship through a lot of areas. We don't know whether he did do that or not, but I thought it was an interesting comment. That's probably where the scrolls were brought and burnt in Acts 19. So that's that area there. Walking along past that Agora now, we're heading towards the theatre, which is up on the right-hand side. And that's it there. Now this is actually, I'm just going to go back to that. So Roman theatres, or Greco-Roman theatres, as this was, they were built on a formula rule basis. So it had to be large enough to hold 10% of the population. So this seated 25,000 people. So they believe the population of Ephesus was around 250,000. Some estimates put up as far as 500,000, depending on whether you counted slaves and whether you counted women in that tally. But most people say it was probably around 250,000, maybe a little bit more. So it's a big city. They would build them, as you can see why, logically, they'd build them on the side of hills. But on this particular one, it needed to be sufficiently large that the hill wasn't large enough. So they built, and you can actually see it to the far right there, they built arches out and they actually increased the width and the height of the hill so they could take it further up the hill. Most of it was marble, a bit more granite up towards the top. The marble has disappeared. With a lot of these places, it got repurposed over the years. As you go up there, the marble there has been worn away by chariot wheels, heading up there into the theatre area. So that's in the theatre itself. If you stand, I'm going to go back to that. If you stand down here, I found that very quite impactful personally. You stand there and you look up at this seating that had 25,000 people, and just imagine if you were Gaius or Aristarchus, and they were dragged in before the people who then screamed for 2 hours, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." And you just think of how overwhelming it would have been. You stand on that spot and you look at this hillside of seats and you can imagine what it would have been like. And what is extraordinary is that the Apostle Paul wanted to run in there with him, but the brethren restrained him. And you can stand there, you can see where he would have wanted to run in from, and you can imagine what that scene would have been like for our two brethren that were standing there in front of it. Now, if you put someone up there, which we did, and you talk down here, you can be heard extremely well. The acoustics and the design of it are just stunning. So literally, I mean, there were a lot of people around, but I was standing there talking to Jacob, and we just were conversing in probably about this tone of voice, and it could be heard. We didn't go right to the top, but heard up there. So quite extraordinary acoustics. And that's what it looked like. Straight Greek theatres didn't have a permanent stage building. That's a Greco-Roman theatre, which had that huge edifice at the back. That, of course, doesn't exist today. And that's starting to walk down the path to the port, looking back up there. And that's looking down towards the port. So all of our brothers and sisters that came in and out of that city would have walked up and down that road. Right, just a few comments. That's obviously the Temple of Diana. It's about 1.5 kilometres from the theatre. They had a sacred road that went round the side of the hill and down to that. It was built 3 times. It was particularly that one which Alexander had offered to rebuild. The populace said no, and they funded it through donations from the wealthy members of the community. 127 columns. The columns were 20 metres high. It's the largest pagan temple that they know of had ever been constructed. In the centre of it, you'll see on the roof, it was open, and there was this statue, and they say probably, they don't know for sure, around 8 to 10 metres high of Diana sitting at the back under that open area. In those days, the temples were tax-free. They were used like a bank. They would lend money, they could buy things, they could buy land, they could speculate, and so they became centres of finance and banking as well. That's a side view of it. That's a model in the Ephesus Museum. They have uncovered some or recovered some statues, idols of Diana. This one is in the Ephesus Museum, and that was found up near the Bouleuterion, between there and the Prytanion, up the top of the city. I won't go into the details of it, apart from the fact that she's wearing a city on her head. And there's a lot of associations with the bee there, actually. There's a bit of debate as to where Ephesus got its name from. Ephesus was a Hittite name for it, and I think it may have come from that. Or apis is the name for a bee, from which we get apiary. And some of the early coins had bees on them as well. Pasa was the name of the mythical queen of the Amazonians. So there's some debate as to where the city got its name from originally. But the bee is used, as you can see there on the left. Actually, you can see the bee on the side of this statue. And there's another one. That one has the sacred deer at the bottom of it as well. And I love that picture because that's all that remains of it today. And the truth is continuing on. Greatest I am of the Ephesians, that's all that's left. There's actually more than that, but to see it, you'll have to visit London. John Turtlewood helped himself and the British Empire to quite a bit of some of the friezes and some of the decorations from the ruins that were dug up. So there's more in the British Empire than you'll see there, in the British Museum, than you'll see there. But I just think it's really appropriate that that place has come and gone and the truth continues on. And I think that's wonderful. Okay, I'm just going to show now a short video clip that is just a reconstruction of what it would have looked like sailing into the city and travelling through the city as a whole. And I just want us to remember, our brethren went into that place. They walked in there and they started preaching the truth. They established a vibrant ecclesia. It became a centre for the work of the truth in Asia and throughout the Gentile area, actually. And I think there's a wonderful message for us that if they can preach the truth and establish ecclesias in a city like that, then we should be able to do so in our cities likewise, with God's blessing. Okay, so I'm going to push the button and hopefully it works. I should say, by the way, this is a marketing video, so just take what they suggest with a grain of salt. Whoops.
Ephesus was one of the 12 cities founded by Greek settlers in Asia Minor around the 10th century before Jesus Christ. In this area, the Aegean Sea occupied 8 kilometers of the current land, reaching a prosperous city blessed by its goddess Artemis, but also by the commerce between East and West. After centuries of fights and looting, since the year 133 before Jesus Christ, the city became part of the Roman Empire. After death, without inheritor, of Attalus III, the last king of Pergamum. Being warned by Rome, the reform of the port began. A port that was more than just a way for the traffic of people and goods. It was also the monumental entrance to the city. The Arcadian Way is an almost 600 metres long avenue which connects the port to the theatre. On the left side, you see the harbour gymnasium and baths, and further away, the Olympia and the district of Curates. To the right, a parallel road led to the Serapeum and the commercial Agora, ending with the gymnasium near to the theatre. The theatre was the centre of Ephesus' social life, with up to 24,000 beholders, a 3-floor scene front, and a privileged sight over the city. Leaving the scene to the south, we cross the Marble Avenue, which borders the commercial Agora, to finally reach a space of great monumental richness. The doors of Maceo and Curates, which give access to the Agora, and next to them, the library of Celsus, with its towering 17-metre-high facade. Inside, there were about 12,000 scrolls, in an 11 by 17 metres open room, which was fully coated with marble. Underneath, remains buried his patron. Here begins the Curates Avenue, with Hadrian's Gate, and illustrious tombs such as the Androclos I, and, probably, Arsinoe I, the unfortunate sister of Cleopatra. There are porticos on each side and strings of insules, with several floors, staggered according to the mountain slope. Each house is usually organised around a central patio, and some of them, like this owned by Gaius Flavius Furius Acto, have a luxurious decoration of marble and mosaics. Going up across the Curates Avenue, to the left, we find the Temple of Hadrian, the Nymphaeum of Trajan, and, after passing the new gate of Hercules, a funerary monument dedicated to Gaius Memmius. In front of a small square with 2 unique large spaces, a monumental facade of Atlanteans that support the upper square, on which the Temple of Domitian stands, and, to the other side, the civilian Agora. With a temple, initially dedicated to Isis, this square of 160 by 73 metres has the main political related buildings. In its northern part, the most relevant one is the Odeon, the one with a semicircular shape. Built in the 2nd century, it was the meeting place for the town council and could hold up to 1,500 people when used for recitals or conferences. A little further to the north, we found other temples. The Crotanias. Baths and houses climbing the mountain. And on the opposite slope, the Curates district, where the stadium and the video gymnasium are the starting point to the way that leads to one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Artemisian. Built over a more modest, earlier one, the second Artemisian is an Ionic and Terrace temple with a floor plan of 115 by 55 meters and 120 columns, almost 20 meters high. Ephesus really was a great city with magnificent public spaces, but if there is something to highlight, it's the great cultural and artistic richness that came, once again, as a result of the meeting between the East and the West.
So their take is that the most important thing is the cultural greatness of the meeting of East and West. Ours is, we had an ecclesia there of our brothers and sisters, and the truth has carried on, and that city hasn't. Good. Thank you.
Don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Drop a comment in the comments section and let us know what you thought, and make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Please share it and spread the word. Thanks for watching, and remember to come back soon.